The chaos of battle raged around Zira, explosions lighting up the void of space, and the deafening roar of engines cutting through the vacuum. Her ship shuddered violently as another blast hit its hull, systems failing one by one. Zira gritted her teeth, her hands moving with practiced precision over the controls, trying to keep the vessel from spiraling out of control. But she knew, deep down, that the situation was dire. The enemy was relentless, and her faction was on the verge of retreat. A sharp pain shot through her side, where shrapnel from a previous hit had pierced her armor. She could feel the warm trickle of blood seeping through the wound, but she pushed the pain aside. Survival was all that mattered now. She scanned the battlefield, searching for an escape route, but her sensors showed nothing but hostile ships closing in. Her comrades' voices crackled through the comms, frantic and desperate, before falling silent one by one. They were abandoning the fight, abandoning her. Zira's ship groaned as another blast hit, and alarms blared as the engines finally gave out. She was losing altitude, the planet below growing larger in her view screen. With a final, desperate push, she angled the ship toward the surface, hoping for a controlled crash rather than a fatal plummet. The atmosphere buffeted the ship as it entered, flames licking at the edges of the hull. The controls were sluggish, responding only partially to her commands. Her vision blurred as the ground rushed up to meet her, and the ship slammed into the rocky terrain with a bone-jarring impact. Metal screeched and tore as the vessel skidded across the surface, finally coming to a halt against a jagged outcrop of rock. For a moment, everything was still. Zira's breath came in ragged gasps, her body protesting every movement. The pain was overwhelming, but she forced herself to stay conscious, to assess the damage. The ship was a twisted wreck, smoke rising from the shattered hull. The cold, unwelcoming planet stretched out around her, a barren wasteland of jagged rocks and lifeless soil. There was no sign of her comrades, no indication that anyone would come for her. She was alone, abandoned in this desolate place. Zira unbuckled herself from the pilot's seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Every inch of her body screamed in agony, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. She needed to find shelter, somewhere to tend to her wounds and gather her strength. But as she staggered out of the wreckage, the full extent of her injuries became clear. Blood soaked her side, and each step sent a fresh wave of pain through her body. The harsh winds whipped around her, cutting through her tattered armor and sapping what little warmth she had left. The planet was cold, unforgiving, a reflection of the emptiness she felt inside. Zira looked up at the sky, the distant stars a cruel reminder of the battle she had lost, of the comrades who had left her behind. She pressed on, forcing herself to keep moving, but her strength was fading fast. The world around her blurred and swayed, her vision narrowing as darkness closed in. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the rough ground, her body too weak to continue. She tried to crawl, to drag herself just a little farther, but even that was too much. Zira lay there, the cold seeping into her bones, her breathing shallow and labored. She thought of her home, of the life she had fought so hard to protect. It all seemed so distant now, like a dream she could no longer grasp. The loneliness pressed down on her, heavier than any wound, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the fear that had been gnawing at the edges of her mind. As her vision dimmed, she wondered if this was how it would end, alone on a barren world, forgotten by those she had served. The thought was unbearable, yet she had no strength left to fight it. Her eyes fluttered shut, her last breath escaping her lips in a quiet sigh. The darkness took her, and the world faded away, leaving nothing but silence and cold. Zira's final thought was of home, a place she would never see again. Jack trudged through the desolate landscape, his steps echoing in the eerie silence of the planet. The cold air bit at his skin, even through the layers of his suit, and the barren terrain stretched out endlessly before him. This planet was just another in a long series of uncharted worlds he had been tasked with mapping, its emptiness typical of the remote sectors he was used to exploring. But something felt different here, a sense of unease creeping into his mind as he pressed forward. His equipment hummed softly, scanning the surroundings for any signs of life or activity. The readouts were mostly blank, Just as he expected, this place was lifeless, or at least it should have been. But the faint trace of energy he had picked up earlier was what brought him here, a signal that didn't belong in such a desolate place. As he approached the source, the remnants of a violent crash became visible in the distance, the twisted metal of an alien ship scattered across the rocky ground. Jack's pulse quickened as he neared the wreckage. The ship was unlike anything he had seen before, its design clearly alien, but the damage was unmistakable, a testament to the fierce battle that had taken place. He scanned the area cautiously, his eyes darting from one piece of debris to the next, searching for any movement. His heart pounded in his chest as he considered the possibility that someone, or something, might still be alive here. The hum of his equipment broke the silence, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone. As he moved closer to the wreckage, he noticed a faint sound, barely audible over the wind, a shallow, labored breathing. Jack froze, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, to leave whatever was here to its fate. But curiosity and a deeper sense of compassion overrode his fear. He couldn't just walk away, not without knowing. He followed the sound, picking his way through the twisted metal until he found the source. There, half buried beneath the wreckage, was a figure, alien, clearly, but humanoid in shape. The being was still, save for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Jack hesitated, his mind racing. This creature could be dangerous, a threat he wasn't equipped to handle. But as he looked closer, he saw the blood, the wounds that marred its body, and the fragile state it was in. Jack knelt beside the alien, his movements slow and deliberate. He could see now that it was a female, her features fierce yet delicate, her body battered and broken from the crash. Her breathing was weak, each breath a struggle that seemed to take all the energy she had left. Despite his fear, Jack felt a pang of empathy. This being was no longer a threat, she was dying. He reached for his medkit, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the necessary tools. He was no doctor, but his training had included basic first aid, enough to stabilize someone in a dire situation. Jack worked quickly, applying pressure to the worst of the wounds, using the limited resources he had to stop the bleeding and reduce the risk of infection. His mind was focused entirely on the task at hand, pushing aside the fear that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The sound of her breathing grew steadier as Jack worked, a small sign that his efforts were making a difference. But he knew she wasn't out of danger yet. Her injuries were severe, and without proper medical care, it was only a matter of time before her condition worsened. He had to get her to safety, but the question of how she would react when she woke up lingered in his mind. Jack stood, glancing around at the wreckage one last time before carefully lifting the alien woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp and unresponsive. As he carried her back toward his ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far beyond his understanding. But he had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. The journey back to his ship was slow, the weight of responsibility pressing down on Jack with each step. The eerie quiet of the planet surrounded him, the only sounds the crunch of his boots on the rocky ground and the hum of his equipment. He glanced down at the alien in his arms, her face pale and drawn, her breathing still shallow but steady. He wondered who she was, what had brought her to this forsaken place, and whether she would survive long enough to tell him. Jack's mind raced with questions as he reached his ship and carefully set the alien woman down inside. He activated the ship's medical unit, setting it to monitor her vital signs and administer basic care. As the machines hummed to life, Jack sat back, watching her closely. He didn't know what he was expecting, but part of him hoped she would wake up, that she would give him some clue as to what had happened. But for now, she remained unconscious, her body still and quiet as the machines worked to stabilize her. Jack sighed, leaning back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He had done all he could for now. The rest was up to fate. As he closed his eyes, his thoughts drifted to what lay ahead. He knew that when she woke up, there would be questions, challenges, and perhaps danger. But he had made a decision when he chose to help her, and he would see it through, whatever the consequences might be. Jack's boots crunched against the rocky ground, the only sound in the stillness of the alien landscape. His visor displayed a readout of the planet's atmosphere, thin, cold, and inhospitable. He was used to solitude, having spent months alone on this mapping mission, but the eerie silence of this world felt different, unsettling. As he scanned the horizon, his eyes caught the glint of metal, something out of place in the barren surroundings. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the holstered weapon at his side. The wreckage was unmistakably alien, a twisted mass of metal and wires that had once been a ship. The signs of battle were clear: scorch marks, debris scattered across the ground, and the faint smell of burnt fuel lingering in the air. Jack's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary crash site. His eyes followed the trail of destruction until he saw her. The alien lay motionless, half buried in the rubble, her body battered and bloodied. For a moment he hesitated. She was clearly wounded, but there was no telling how dangerous she could be. Jack's training had taught him to be cautious, to avoid unnecessary risks. But as he looked closer, he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was still alive. His decision was made in an instant. Jack crouched beside her, his hands moving swiftly to assess her injuries. The alien's armor was unlike anything he had seen before, and beneath it, her skin was a deep, rich color, marred by wounds that oozed dark blood. He worked quickly, his field medical kit open beside him. The hum of his equipment filled the air as he applied a bioseal to the worst of the wounds, his hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. As he worked, Jack's mind raced. This alien was unlike any species he had encountered, and he knew nothing of her physiology. But the basics were universal: stop the bleeding, stabilize the vitals. He injected a dose of pain suppressant, hoping it would work on her biology. All the while, he kept an ear out for any sign of danger, the silence around them amplifying his every move. Her breathing was faint, but it was there. He had done all he could for now. Carefully, he lifted her, noting the surprising weight of her armor, and carried her back to his camp. His ship's automated systems could monitor her condition while he figured out what to do next. The camp was a small, makeshift setup, with a fire crackling softly in the center. Jack laid the alien down on a thermal mat, adjusting the settings to accommodate her physiology as best he could. The fire's warmth filled the space, a stark contrast to the cold, barren world outside. He sat back, watching her closely, his mind a whirl of questions. Who was she? What had happened out there? And most pressing of all, what would she do when she woke up? Despite his training, Jack couldn't shake the unease settling in his gut. Helping a wounded alien was one thing, but the uncertainty of her reaction loomed over him. Would she see him as a savior or a threat? He had no way of knowing, and that unknown gnawed at him. As he tended to her, Jack couldn't help but think of the loneliness that had driven him to take this mission. The endless void of space had a way of isolating a person, making them yearn for any kind of connection. This alien, whoever she was, had been left behind, just as he had been left to his own devices out here. There was a strange, unspoken bond in that, though he doubted she would see it the same way. Hours passed, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, and the faint hum of his ship's systems. Jack checked her vitals again, still stable, though her condition was far from good. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. There was nothing more he could do now but wait. His mind wandered as he watched the flames dance, the glow casting flickering shadows across the walls of the tent. He knew this encounter could change everything. The rules of space exploration were clear: avoid contact unless absolutely necessary, and never interfere with another species. Yet here he was, having done the opposite. But what choice had he had? Leaving her to die wasn't an option he could live with. The night dragged on, the cold creeping in despite the fire. Jack wrapped himself in a thermal blanket, his eyes never leaving the alien's form. She seemed so fragile now, so different from the fearsome warrior he had initially imagined. He wondered what her story was, what battles she had fought, and why she had been left behind. As dawn broke, Jack's eyes grew heavy. Exhaustion tugged at him, but he resisted the urge to sleep. This was only the beginning. When she woke, There would be questions to answer, fears to address, and a fragile trust to build. He only hoped he was up to the task. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as Zira and Jack fell into a tenuous rhythm. Zira, though still weak, began to regain some of her strength. She moved with caution, her injuries forcing her to take things slowly. Jack was patient, always nearby, offering assistance without words, his actions speaking louder than any attempts at conversation. Zira was wary at first, her trust hard-won after the betrayal she had experienced. But Jack's consistent care, his steady presence, began to chip away at her defenses. She observed him closely, noting how he always kept his distance, never forcing interaction but always there when she needed help. It was a new experience for her, this quiet cooperation with someone so different, yet so similar in their shared struggle to survive. As the days passed, they ventured further from the camp, exploring the planet's unforgiving terrain. Zira, familiar with the dangers that lurked in such environments, pointed out areas to avoid, places where the ground was unstable or where predatory creatures might be hiding. Jack listened attentively, his respect for her knowledge evident in the way he adjusted their course based on her guidance. Jack's knowledge of survival tactics was equally valuable. He taught Zira how to use his equipment, tools that were foreign to her but incredibly effective in this harsh landscape. He prepared meals from the meager supplies they had, always ensuring she had enough to eat, even when it meant rationing his own portions. His medical care was constant, checking her wounds, applying treatments that eased her pain and accelerated her healing. Their conversation started slowly, haltingly. Zira was cautious, her words measured, revealing little at first. Jack, sensing her need for space, kept his questions to a minimum, allowing her to share at her own pace. They spoke of their worlds, their lives before this fateful encounter. Zira found herself drawn to the simplicity of Jack's tales, his straightforward approach to life a stark contrast to the complex and often brutal existence she had known. Over time, Zira began to open up, sharing more about her people, the battles she had fought, the life she had led before being left behind. She spoke of the fear that had gripped her as she lay in the wreckage, abandoned and alone, her fate seemingly sealed. Jack listened intently, never interrupting, his empathy clear in his expression. Jack, in turn, spoke of his own isolation, the solitude of his mission, and the reasons that had driven him to explore the farthest reaches of the galaxy. He shared stories of his own struggles, the loneliness that had become a constant companion, and the unexpected comfort he found in Zira's presence. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the battles they each faced, both externally and within themselves. Zira's initial distrust began to fade as she saw the genuine care in Jack's actions, the way he never hesitated to help, even when it meant putting himself at risk. She admired his resilience, the way he faced each challenge with determination and skill. There was strength in him, a quiet fortitude that matched her own, and she found herself relying on him more and more as the days passed. The landscape around them seemed to shift as their relationship evolved. The barren, hostile environment gave way to small pockets of life, areas where the ground was fertile enough to support vegetation, where water trickled from hidden springs. Zira led Jack to these places, sharing what she knew of the planet's hidden resources, and in return, he used his technology to purify the water, to make the land more hospitable for them both. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, forged in the crucible of survival. Zira began to trust Jack in ways she had not trusted anyone in a long time. She felt a connection to him, something deeper than mere gratitude for saving her life. He was more than just a companion, he was a partner, someone who understood her in a way that few ever had. Zira shared her deepest fears with Jack, the terror of being left behind, of never being found, of fading into obscurity on this desolate world. Jack listened, offering words of comfort, of reassurance. He spoke of hope, of the possibility of rescue, but also of the strength they had found in each other, the way they had become more than the sum of their parts by working together. In those moments, Zira realized that she was no longer alone. She had found an ally in the most unexpected of places, a bond that transcended their differences and forged something new, something strong. It was a bond that gave her hope, not just for survival, but for a future beyond the confines of this harsh, unforgiving planet. And for the first time since her crash, she felt a glimmer of something she thought she had lost forever, a sense of belonging. The signal had been weak, barely detectable, but it was enough. Zira and Jack had spent days trying to repair the communication device, their hope waning with each failed attempt. But finally, the message had gone through. Now, standing together in the clearing they had discovered, they waited in silence, the weight of the impending farewell pressing down on them. Zira's heart was heavy with conflicting emotions. She had longed for this moment, the hope of rescue keeping her going through the darkest hours. Yet now that it was here, the reality of leaving Jack behind was harder to face than she had ever imagined. He had become more than just a companion in survival. He had become a part of her life, someone she trusted, someone who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had never faltered. The sound of the approaching ship reached them before they saw it, a low rumble growing louder as it descended from the sky. Zira's pulse quickened, a mixture of relief and sorrow coursing through her. She glanced at Jack, trying to read his expression, but his face was unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind a calm exterior. The ship touched down with a soft thud, the engines humming as they powered down. Zira's faction had come for her, just as she had hoped, but the sight of the ship, the familiar insignia emblazoned on its side, filled her with a sense of dread. These were her people, the ones she had fought for, the ones who had left her to die. And now, they were here to take her back. Jack stood beside her, silent but present, his presence grounding her in the moment. She had no words for the conflict raging inside her, the pull between duty and the bond she had formed with him. He had given her so much, and now, as the doors of the ship opened, she realized just how much it would cost her to leave him behind. A figure emerged from the ship, armored and imposing, a reminder of the life she had led before. They spoke in her language, their tone formal, distant, as they informed her that she would be taken back to her people, that she had been missed, that her return was a relief to all. But Zira heard the emptiness in their words, the hollow promise of a return to normalcy that no longer held the same appeal. She turned to Jack, her eyes searching his for something, anything, that could make this easier. But all she found was understanding, a quiet acceptance that this was how it had to be. He had known all along that this moment would come, and he had prepared himself for it, even if she hadn't. "Thank you," Zira said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, a mere shadow of the gratitude she felt. But Jack nodded, his expression softening, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice steady. "Just promise me you'll be okay." Zira swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She wanted to say so much more, to tell him how much he had meant to her, how much she had changed because of him. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out, her hand resting on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared. "I will," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I won't forget you." Jack nodded again, the bittersweet reality of the moment settling in. He had known from the start that this would be the outcome, that she would leave, and that he would be left behind. But knowing didn't make it any easier. He had come to care for her in ways he hadn't expected, and the thought of returning to his solitary existence without her was a bitter pill to swallow. The armored figure motioned for Zira to follow, and she hesitated for only a moment before stepping away from Jack. The distance between them felt insurmountable, each step a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. As she approached the ship, she looked back one last time, her eyes locking with Jack's, a silent farewell passing between them. The ship's engines roared to life as she boarded, the sound vibrating through the clearing, filling the space where their words had failed. Zira took a seat, her heart heavy as the doors closed, sealing her off from the world she had known for those brief but unforgettable days. As the ship lifted off, she kept her gaze fixed on the spot where Jack stood, watching as the distance grew, as he became smaller and smaller, until finally, he was nothing more than a speck on the vast landscape below. Jack watched the ship disappear into the sky, a mixture of pride and loss swelling within him. He had done what he set out to do. He had helped her survive, helped her find her way back to her people. But in doing so, he had lost something too, something intangible but deeply felt. The clearing was silent now, the sound of the ship's engines fading into the distance, leaving him alone once more. Yet, as he turned to leave, he felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet fulfillment in knowing that he had made a difference, that he had been there when she needed him most. And as he walked back to his camp, the memory of her promise lingered in his mind, a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the world around him.